So the student movement and the women's movement and left-wing Catholicism, all sorts of interesting things. So I went to Italy and I interviewed all these people, and it was wonderful. It didn't have anything to do with the Holocaust. And I had that experience of doing that much, so those many interviews, that much oral history, that I started to really reflect on how people tell their stories, because I'd heard so many. I thought, yeah, it's interesting. People always start their stories the same way. And if I came and interviewed you and we sat down and did an oral history interview and I said, Susan, tell me your life story, you'd probably start from the same place too. Most people start their story, they talk about their parents and the town they grew up in, and maybe some background about both sides of the family and their siblings and their house and their neighborhood and their street. This is how we start our stories. What if you don't know? That's what really drew me to this group, I have to admit. What if you can't answer that question with such profound repercussions? How do you make sense of your life if you don't know where you come from? And in this book, I look at the stories of 100 different child survivors, and there were many who did not ever find out their parents' names, or only learned much later in life who their parents had been, did not know anything about the towns they came from, in rare cases, did not know their own birth names. So I really wanted to dig into that issue of how you tell who you are when you don't know those very basic, components of your origin story, I suppose. And for this group of children who were all 10 or younger, some as young as my mother, born in 1944, of course, they either had no pre-war memories or only very indistinct and fuzzy pre-war memories. And because there was often no adult left alive who was willing to fill in the key details of those early days and years, these child survivors often faced what was then a decades-long struggle to put that story together. And one of the things I really realized in writing this book is that, it seems simple on the surface, but it is an essential act of autobiography to be able to describe where you're from. And if you can't tell that, you need to take a different route to tell the story of who you are. So how is this kind of question there is, how do you make sense of your childhood and who do you explain who you are? Or sorry, how do you explain who you are? Now, most of us can tell those stories of where we came from because somebody helped us to put our early memories together. So one of the things, I'm not a psychologist, but I really, really enjoyed as part of researching this book, reading a lot about child developmental psychology. And in a nutshell, and I'm sure everybody knows this anyway, we tend not to remember the first 3 years of our lives. This is a phenomenon called infantile amnesia. And then for some years after that, the first 3 or 4 years tend to be inaccessible. And then after that, we have fragmentary memories that go on for a long time. But we tend to be able to tell them in a kind of chronological or logical order because someone helped us to do it. This is the social world of early memory. So the gaps are filled in by our parents and our siblings and our relatives and the people in our neighborhood. And that's true for all of us. We might think, oh, okay, I can see the coherent and logical order to these things, but that's because at some point, someone helped you string that all together. So if you don't have that community and you don't have that family, and all you're left with is fragments of memory, what happens then? Indeed, I have to say that writing the book made me appreciate for the first time in my life just what a privilege it is to have answers to those questions. But child survivors, certainly many child survivors, were left with scraps of memory that they couldn't interpret. And as they grew, they had to piece things together for themselves. In a sense, they had to become historians of their own lives. So as I've said, the book follows a group of 100 young child survivors out of the ruins of war, into diaspora across the globe, and right through the 7 decades of their post-war lives up to the present. I was interested in how the relationship between memory and identity changed over time. So So not just what happened to these children, but how they remembered that and how then they remembered that differently and made a different kind of sense out of those memories all through their lives, you know, when they were teenagers and when they were entering adulthood and when they were having their first children and putting their jobs together and maybe later getting divorced, watching their parents die. At every crucial life stage and in all these changing historical moments, they thought about their pasts differently, as we all do. I was also really interested in the shift from what you might call a kind of atomized individual experience to the emergence of a more collective sense of what is a child survivor, because that term itself only emerges in the 1980s. There's certainly lots of people who I might call child survivors who wouldn't call themselves that. I think my mom is probably one of them. But there were most of the people in the book were in some ways active in a kind of movement, I suppose, to be recognized as survivors. And this was a really fraught process for a lot of child survivors who were often told point blank by older survivors, you're not really a survivor. Instead, you should consider yourself lucky because you are alive when so many other children died. And so the book also charts this exploration of identity, of what it means to be a survivor and how you can, you know, at what point you might want to seize on that identity. So to do all that, I drew on oral history. That is what I do. Primarily, I have always been an oral historian, which means only that I interview people about their lives. And that's a very important source for me. But I don't use oral interviews out of context. I always wed them with archival documents. So in addition to doing about 25 of my own interviews and then putting that together with 75 existing interviews for a total of 100, I also used things like children's case reports from the 1940s, restitution claims, psychiatric documents, the files from care homes and orphanages, all sorts of things, children's letters, children's drawings, everything and anything that I could find in the archives. Often then working so that I sort of put people together. So I'd have the case report for an individual child from 1948, for example, and then I would have later oral history with that same child to compare how their stories change over time is part of it as well. And I tried very hard in the book to challenge some fundamental assumptions, certainly assumptions that historians who work on this topic have, about children as subjects. Some of the times I was challenging my own assumptions, really, about what children are capable of as agents, as historical agents in their own right, and about the nature of trauma, and about the relationship between the self and memory. And fundamentally, I think it's really a book about how we remember our childhoods. And my feeling is, and I know some of you have read the book, I really hope this is true, that the funny thing is I've never thought about it as a book about child survivors. I think about it as a book about remembering your childhood. And everybody can understand that because we have all tried to make sense of our childhoods as we age. And we are probably all aware we've done it differently at different points in our lives, as different parts of our childhoods have had different meanings for us. And in my mind, that's really what the book is about. It's about how we remember, especially if you've had a traumatic childhood, a chaotic childhood. How have you made sense of it? So I've always hoped that it would appeal to quite a wide audience who might see, okay, it's about child survivors of the Holocaust, but it's a kind of extreme slice of a much more common experience. And my real hope is that many people will see something of their own experience reflected in the book. So I'll stop there and I'm going to pass over to my mom. And she and I have had a discussion about, she's going to tell you a bit about her own story, but I hope in a way that it will reflect on what I've just said.
Wow. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Wow. Welcome to everybody, especially to dear old friends and family members that I haven't seen in too long. and friends from Kingston as well. Um, so I wanted to just start with my own treasured copy of the book here, which arrived at my door way back last August because Rebecca had sent it to me. The postman rang the bell, and I opened the package and I read the inscription, and it said, "To Mom, it both is and is not all about you. Love, Reb." And so that brought tears to my eyes right away. And then as I read the book, and I also savored it really slowly, partially because it was difficult stories, but partially because the words are so delicious and I so enjoyed the writing. I had so many moments of recognition of where she was coming from, of how our family history, particularly of how I told it to her, had influenced the work. So I'd like to share a bit of that history with you today. So I was born in Budapest, Hungary in July of 1944, possibly the worst place and time to come into this earth, but some of you come close, perhaps just as well. The Hungarian Holocaust had been forging ahead in full blast since March. Because my family was Jewish, my mom had to wear the yellow star on her arm, and she was not allowed to get on the streetcar. She had to walk to the hospital to give birth. The next day, the nuns at the hospital told her to get us baptized as quickly as possible to become Catholic if she hoped to survive, which my mom, being a practical person who wanted to live, she did. My father had already been taken away, alas, never to return. So she had nobody to help her. From that time on, until Hungary was liberated in April of 1945, we were on the run, trying to hide, trying to evade the Nazis who had already captured her parents and her sister and deported them to Auschwitz. My father's family, including his father, his 4 brothers, and 1 sister, had all been taken as well, along with some of my cousins who were only little children. The city around us was under siege. The buildings had been bombed. All 7 bridges in Budapest were blown up. As my mom tried to shelter and feed me and my older brother, Andy, and I was a baby in her arms as we were running from place to place, sometimes to bomb shelters, sometimes squatting in an empty house where she had to chop furniture for heating fuel. She had little food, so no milk for me, once none for 4 days, but luckily, somehow I slept. Once we were even captured and standing in a line of Jewish people who were being shot into the Danube, but escaped due to the mercy of the guard who winked at my mother and nodded his head for us to run. Of course, I remember none of this, only the aftermath. I really had no idea how traumatized everybody around me must have been. It just seemed normal. I just recall the feelings of oppression and weariness hanging over me like a black cloud. I looked up fearfully to the sky every time a plane flew overhead. The city was gray and gritty, broken glass, broken bricks everywhere. All the buildings were pockmarked by bullet holes. And our apartment building was even partly destroyed. My mom had to shout to scare away the rats that lived in the bombed out part across the hall every time she opened the door. Even our few bits of furniture bore gashes from the hatchets that people had used to try to break into the locked cabinets. A pair of my father's shoes was in the closet, but where was he? I asked and asked. I waited and I waited for him to come through the door, but it never happened. He never came back. And I could never find out what had happened to him. I was so envious of the other children at school who had fathers and even grandparents. Imagine that. And I kept asking my mom, where were mine? Where were mine? She would not or could not answer, partly because she really didn't know, especially not at first. If she was ever given any official notice as to what happened to her husband, she never told me. After a while, she gave up hope, and she finally remarried when I was 10, 2 years later, at the time of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Our family escaped from Hungary as refugees and made our way to Canada, a new life. I was not an orphan. My mother had courageously kept our little family together and alive. She supported us by going to work immediately after the liberation. She worked 6 days a week, though, from early morning till late in the evening, so she was hardly ever home, and she was exhausted when she did get there. It proved impossible to get her to talk about the past, to try and sort out what had happened, and there was simply nobody else to ask. I understood it had something to do with being Jewish, but it was very confusing also because my mom said that we were not Jewish. It was a religion we did not believe in or practice. Anyway, religions were illegal in communist Hungary. If anybody asked if I was Jewish, I was told to deny it vehemently. I also understood that terrible things must have happened to the people, like my father and grandparents, who always were said not to have died, but to have not come back. But it seemed impossible to find out from where. My mom was focused on the struggles of daily life, no looking back in the past for her. I only recall seeing her crying twice. Once when her sister was visiting, her sister who had come back from many months in Auschwitz. And they hugged each other and sobbed and sobbed. Another time we were visiting a neighbor, an old lady, who had a picture of a young woman on the piano where we were sitting at. My mom was trying to play. And then she asked about the young woman. The two of them hugged each other and cried, again in that wordless way. Whatever had happened, it was too awful. It was too enormous to be put into words. We came to Canada. I was 12 and I loved it here. The world was clean and colorful, safe and prosperous, and the people were incredibly kind. I sort of forgot about my early life and embraced the new. As I grew up, of course, I heard and read about the Holocaust, but still didn't know exactly when and where and how my relatives, including my father, had perished. If people asked, I just said, oh, they had died in the war. And everybody seemed to accept that. In Canada, I actually attended a Catholic school, having been baptized. Um, and I never, ever told anybody about my Jewish background. I didn't even think of myself as Jewish, and certainly not as a Holocaust survivor, as Rebecca has just said. While I regretted deeply not having known my real father, nor many of my other close relatives, I somehow figured that I had not actually lost them since we had never met. I'd never been to a cemetery, nor attended a funeral until I was almost 35 years old, and even considered myself to be somehow lucky because of that. I hadn't lost anybody. I did, however, continue to ask my mom to tell me about her family history, and always wrote down and carefully stashed away every little bit of information that she shared with me. She could speak of things more somehow as the years passed, as she got older, and so we all did. Still, it was only in 2004, when I was about 60 years old, that I finally saw an official document about my father's death. This was at the then recently opened Holocaust Museum in Budapest, where they gave me a little piece of paper. I gave it a name and they gave me, oh, here you are, a little piece of paper which had my father's name, date of birth, and date of death. He was said to have died in March of 1945 in a town called Neitzank, which I'd never heard of. It also told me where his name was etched into the museum glass on the wall of Holocaust victims. I looked, and there it was, and I had to sit on the floor for a while to regain my composure. Luckily, my daughter was with me. It was only after my mom's death, which was in 2017, and she was 100 years of age at the time, that I was finally able to sort out all those little snippets of paper with bits of family history that I had collected from her over the years. And during the past year, because of the extra time at home due to the pandemic, I have actually managed to build a pretty comprehensive family tree. It was only in the last year, and I am now 76 years old, that I could finally put names to my grandparents and even great-grandparents. Sadly, I've also become aware of just how many members of my tree had died in 1944 and 1945. All those dear relatives I should have known, I should have laughed with and cried with and built memories with. Like me, when Rebecca was a little girl, she also was very curious and asked many questions. I tried my best to answer them, but when it came to family history, my story was full of the holes, absences, confusion, and silences that she writes about in her book so eloquently. She sometimes tried to ask my mom directly, her grandmother, but with little success. Once in grade school, she phoned her to ask about the names of her parents, which I could not give her and which she needed for a school project. But my mom told her just to use any name she wanted. She could not talk about it. Not being one to be brushed off so easily, my daughter has made it her life's work to immerse herself in that period of history with the amazing results, which brings us back to survivors. That's it.
Thank you, Mom.
Child.
Thank you so much, Julia, and Rebecca, of course. Um,
I hope you can all see how similar we look, in addition to sharing our stories. I look on the screen in Zoom and I see my own, my glasses and my round cheeks and the shape of my face. And I look at Mom and I think it's the same. Sorry, Susan, not to interrupt you.
It's fine. There are a couple of questions that I wanted to ask, and I don't want to talk about me, but I just have to frame them in the context that I'm a physician and I do research. And so I come from this sort of science-based approach to research. And I think both of the questions arise in a sense from that. And the first is about the intersection of personal history and studying history, because in science, one is not supposed to insert oneself into research in any way. I realize that with qualitative research, that's somewhat different, but I'm curious about how a story that was so fundamentally personal, how you jumped between the study and the personal. And this is for Rebecca.
That is a great question. And it's funny that, it's funny in a sense, because I've got a fabulous doctoral student at the minute who she's half in history and half in psychology, but she comes from a history background. So the psychology part is she's been trained in a psychology lab and it's very new to her. I mean, not now, she's in her third year, but it was at first. And at first she found it quite difficult, but also she laughed a lot at how far the psychologist went to do, just as you say, Susan, to try to not get involved, to try to sort of be cold and clinical, actually. And she laughed because she is also an oral historian by training. It's just like, she's like, but you can't. As soon as you go in, you are part of that that relationship. So I think I can say, I can speak to the nature of doing oral history, and then I can say something about myself personally as well. Because it was Susan and I were corresponding, and we talked a little bit about the ways in which both the interviewers and the interviewees' perception of what you're supposed to discuss in an interview sits quite heavily on the interview. In fact, I've written quite a bit about that before I even started to work on this project. It's almost like there's a third person in the room, right? There's you, and there's the person you're interviewing, and then there's this other person, which is the expectations about what you think you're supposed to say and what you think you're supposed to hear. And it's it makes it so that you never get the same interview twice. So if in a sense, if you're trying, this is what happened when we were discussing with the psychologists, and they said, I don't quite understand what's going on with oral history. How do you collect the memories? I was like, well, you don't collect the memories. You're having an interactive relationship with somebody, and the person you are affects what that person will tell you. And so you will never, in a sense, get the same interview twice. It will always be different. And that is something that puts a lot of historians off oral history. It frightens them, I think. There's a very famous oral historian who once said, Sandro Portelli, one of the most famous oral historians, he said, look, oral history isn't about what happened in the past. And if you want to know the facts about what happened in the past, it is not the right thing to use. But what it will tell you is what people believe happened in the past and what they wish had happened and what they fear happened. And that is worth a lot. And I've always really held on to that quote because I think it's very powerful. We don't in oral history tap into the past and it directly. And actually one of the great challenges of this project, because I think I told you at the beginning, I really wanted to explore children as subjects, not as objects. Children are so often treated by adults as objects, especially these children. Were often sort of pushed around and kind of moved from place to place as if they were objects, but they were subjects in their own right. And in the middle of that sentence, I forgot where I was going with this. Oh, right. And I wanted to access their emotions and their opinions, directly. And I couldn't, of course, because if I do an interview with somebody and they're now 78 years old, they aren't telling me how they felt as a child. They're telling me how they remember feeling as a child, which is not the same thing. And I can go into the archives and try to find their voices in the archives, but it's almost impossible because almost all archival documents are written by adults. And even those made by children, and I did find a few things like children's drawings and children's letters, even there you have to ask, was the child told to write this letter? Were they told what to draw? How far was it spontaneous? So it's very, very hard to directly access a child's voice, but oral history does give us a great deal in terms of telling us what we feel now about our childhood. So in terms of my approach to oral history, I think that it's that human relationship in the creating it is actually really delicious. And no, it's very unscientific in many ways. You will never get the same thing twice. Now, the question of that personal, the issue of my own family history and how far I brought it into what I did. I was really adamant that my own family story should never impose itself on the stories of these 100 children. But having said that, did I tell them? Yeah, of course I told them, because it's part of, it's so funny reflecting on what Susan said, it was part of my wanting to show them how deeply I cared. And also hopefully putting it out there that I did understand I was coming from a not dissimilar background. Sometimes it's important to start the groundwork when you're doing oral history just by building up a relationship of trust. And I took a chance in a lot of ways in thinking this is going to help build that relationship of trust. But it's something I mentioned only at the beginning, usually when I was setting up an interview on the phone, and never again. And one of the things that was wonderful about the project is how, it might seem that I have a similar family background, but actually the stories that I was told bear almost no resemblance to my own family story. They were so different, and how glad I was that, that to find that out, they challenged all my assumptions. It turns out my family is very unusual in a lot of ways, and great. It was fabulous to hear that. So the answer is yes and no. And it wasn't particularly scientific, Susan. I'll be honest. It was very much a historian's take on how to do this.
But I think actually what I learned from reading it was that we delude ourselves if we think that science is so scientific, and this whole question of what is truth. So I travel in circles where it is very important to figure out how to interview a patient. And when I read your book, I thought I have learned way more about how to take a person's history and how to hear that history from reading your book than I've ever learned in medicine, because what I learned was people shape their story to fit what they think the interviewer wants to hear. And I was very troubled by the "but what is truth" question. But I don't know if you want to give an example or two from the book about some of the stories that unfolded, that clearly were being told because the child wanted a certain outcome or expected that the interviewer wanted a certain outcome.
I can give a story off the top of my head, and I can also, I'm just saying, Paul and Janice, I can see that your hands are up. So just to be aware.
And let me just say, after this, I'll like intervene and ask people, okay, do you want to ask a question?
So the story I can tell you, hopefully I'm not gonna, I hate winging it in some ways with these stories, because I'm very aware that they belong to these children. And sometimes I paraphrase, something from the interview, and I always feel a little funny putting their words out of my mouth. But this particular story, I didn't actually interview the person involved. I used an existing interview, so maybe it's a bit different. This is a Canadian story, because the Canadian Jewish Congress ran a scheme to bring 1,000 what they called Jewish war orphans to Canada in between 1948 and 1952. They ended up bringing more than 1,000, a very, very admirable scheme. It was not the only scheme. There was a British scheme, a South African scheme, and an Australian one, but the Canadian one was probably the most successful. So among the many children who came to Canada on this scheme was a boy named Aaron B. Now, the thing with the Canadian scheme was that to come on the scheme, you had to be a full orphan. So it should surprise nobody to find that many children lied about the survival of a parent, because they were stuck in DP camps and they wanted to move on with their lives. And so to get to Canada, to get out of that really horrific conditions in Europe and move on, many children lied. They lied about their ages, they lied about their health, and they lied about whether or not they had a surviving parent. So Aaron B, I can see my copy of the book is over on the bed. So what happened is the Canadian Jewish Congress sent officers over to the DP camps in Europe to interview children. So they had these kind of life history interviews, and they're all scribbled down in their case files. I was very, very lucky to be able to see the case files, which are in Montreal. So the case worker from the Canadian Jewish Congress took down this child's report. So it says that he was first, I'm trying to remember it. He's in a ghetto, and then he's sort of smuggled out, and he's living with, Gentile family in the countryside. And then at some point after the war, his aunt finds him, and she takes him, and they go to a DP camp, and he wants to immigrate on this scheme, and the aunt wants to come because Canada also has a scheme for trained tailors and seamstresses. So all these notes are there in the case file. And so he comes on the scheme for orphans, and his aunt comes on the scheme for seamstresses. And the Canadian Jewish Congress does not cotton on to what's going on until maybe towards the end. The very last file in his case, the very last piece of paper in his case file says, Mrs. B is the aunt. I think they are figuring out by this point that his aunt is actually his mother. Now, there were a lot of stories in the Canadian Jewish Congress files just like this. So finding that children had recounted a version of their wartime experience that was a complete lie was very common, because we can, all of us, understand the motivation. And I would venture to say any of us would have done the same thing. It was an absolutely cruel policy that would have children emigrate but wouldn't take their surviving parents. So I think we can be sympathetic about the reasons for the lie. What's really interesting in the case of Aaron B is that in the mid-1990s, he gave an interview to a big oral history project called the Survivors of the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. And in that interview, keeping in mind that he had to lie basically for, I can't remember, it's like something like 6 or 7 years, he pretended his mother was his aunt. In that interview, he never reveals the lie. In fact, he actually says something. It threw me for a loop for a while. He says, oh, yes, I came to Canada on this special scheme. Well, at first the scheme was only for orphans, but then at some point they couldn't find enough orphans. So they decided they would take half orphans. And that's when I came with my mother. This was fairly early on in my research. And I thought, oh, I didn't realize they took half orphans. I went and started to research the scheme. They never took half orphans. But it was so interesting that, 50 years later, he still felt he had to cover. He still had to protect his mother in some ways from the repercussions of that lie. But I love this because I think it's a really excellent example of how children are subjects. He was fully conscious of the fact that he was lying. He did it of his own free will. It is an example of a child as a subject, subversive subject, challenging, lying, getting through the system how they can. There were so many examples like that in the book. They surprised me every time. But the way in which those lies, which made complete sense, for example, in 1948, the way they then show up in later memory is really fascinating. Keeping in mind, of course, that many children who survived the Holocaust did so in hiding with false identities, sometimes actually unpicking the truth from the lies became impossible. Sometimes for me as the researcher, it also was impossible.
I think it also shows resilience on the part of those then children. So I'm going to, if you want to ask a question, can you either raise your hand and you do that under the reactions button, or just put your name in the chat and I'll call on you, because I can't see everybody's little boxes. So Paul or Catherine, I'm not sure who.
Okay, and Janice Barling and I had our hands up. I've really enjoyed this introduction, Rebecca. I did have a question, but a comment first. I can understand why people have been through that trauma, either that they remembered themselves or transmitted by their parents, would lie so late in their lives. And it may be because they know the power of bureaucracies and governments and what they did to their family at early ages. And no matter how long you've lived, you may feel that somehow past events could still influence you now. And but the question I wanted to ask is, amongst the tens of thousands of survivors whose stories you had an opportunity to focus on, you chose these particular 100.
If you want to know how I chose the 100, I'm afraid that it was also, again, not very scientific. So 1/4 of them, I didn't choose them. I suppose they chose me, because I started the project by putting a number of advertisements in things like the Child Survivors Association of Great Britain's regular newsletter. So I did the same in the United States and in Canada to a lesser extent. So I asked child survivors to contact me, and then I kind of did things in reverse. I started by interviewing them, and then I went and found their case files in the archives where possible. So 1/4 of the interviews were found that way. So it was a very, it wasn't a representative sample, I suppose. It was people who, because you have to bear in mind, of course, if they went out of their way to contact me, they wanted to talk about their past. The people I didn't ever talk to in the project were those who don't want to talk about their past for obvious reasons, but I'm quite aware that it's a skewed sample in the book in many ways, because there are lots of child survivors who don't want to talk. So they are not represented. So for 25%, so actually 25, around 25, I interviewed them, and then I went and searched in the archives for documents about them from their earlier lives. And then for the remainder, I started with the archives. Like, for example, in the Canadian case, I looked at the case files. It's very rare to be able to see children's case files. In European archives, it's impossible because of data protection. So I was actually really lucky to be able to access case files in Canada. Canada was the only country that allowed me to do so. Sorry. And so for the remainder, I started with the case files or whatever else I could find in the archives. And I then looked to find either if I could find that person and if they'd allow me to interview them, or if I could find existing interviews with them. So again, the choice was made by the fact that they wanted at some point to talk about their pasts. There was one other deciding factor. I realized pretty early on that almost everybody who I was speaking to or whose case files I was looking at, they had all left Europe, as indeed the majority of child survivors did. And then I thought, well, maybe I should just make this a kind of criteria, because that double dislocation of being first a survivor and then a refugee or an immigrant, it adds another dimension, and I felt it unified their stories. So all the 100 child survivors also left Europe. They ended up in Canada, the US, Australia, Israel, and Great Britain. And so that, again, I mean, it is, I think I call it in the book, a double dislocation. It's having your, the language and culture that you're rooted in torn up twice, really. And so it's a particular experience. And beyond that, it was fairly random. But I have to say, when I think about who contacted me or who I found through those means, they were probably roughly just, it happened to work out that they were 50% men, 50% women. As I said, I've told you the countries they settled in. They came from almost every country in Europe. I was quite stunned by that. But in terms of backgrounds, this was really a continent-wide story, as it were. And then they had extremely different experiences. I can see, Helen has asked, they ended up only in English-speaking countries plus Israel. No, but because I was using these big existing oral history interview collections, most of those are in the English language. I know that seems a little bonkers, but it is the case that most of those projects are American. It doesn't mean all the interviews in the collection are necessarily in English, but it means that most of the people who have been interviewed ended up in the United States or Canada or Australia or New Zealand. There were some in South Africa. Of course, there were child survivors who immigrated to Argentina and Brazil, other countries in Africa, other places in the world, of course. And then there were those who stayed in Europe as well. But it happens because of the nature of those big oral history projects that most of the survivors in the book either ended up in the Anglo-American world or in Israel.
Whoops. Rabbi Tepper, you wanted to ask a question. You're muted. You're muted. Rabbi Tepper, you have to unmute. Okay.
Okay. Can you all hear me?
I can hear you. No, I can no longer hear you.
I'm Rabbi Bill Tepper of Ir HaMelech congregation in Kingston, but I'm talking to you from Toronto, from my home in Toronto. I don't think we can overstate how important it is to learn the story, learn about the story that Rebecca is telling us, and then Julia has also shared with us, because we all know that as time goes by, we're moving further and further away from the years of the Holocaust, and it becomes more of an imperative that the stories be told and that the stories be remembered. And what I've learned from this program is that we have to redefine what it means to be a survivor. Because I think for so long, so many of us have thought of survivors as being just those who survived the death camps, okay, and just adults, because it's our understanding that the greater number of children, 1.5 million children who went into the death camps, did not come out. So what Rebecca's and Julia's stories teach us is that being a survivor doesn't necessarily mean having survived the death camps, but having survived some kind of trauma or moment associated with the Holocaust. My father was a survivor, but my father was not a survivor of the death camps. My father was a survivor of a Soviet labor camp in Kazakhstan. Okay, his family in Poland managed to get him out. Okay, so even though he was not in a death camp, I still always thought of my father as a survivor, and he was the only one of his family did survive, to be truthful. So again, I'm very thankful to Rebecca and Julia for sharing these stories with us.
Rabbi Tepper, thank you so much. You know, there's a story in the book. I don't actually know that I ever fully explain it in the book, but it's also from the Canadian Jewish Congress files. And it's a brother and a sister who tell this story, again, tell this long story to come to Canada about how the problem is I can't quite remember the story, but they tell a story basically about moving through Poland during the war and then ending up in a German DP camp after the war, a pretty typical story. And it's only through the oral history that it's revealed to be, again, completely untrue. I'm not sure why the children felt compelled to lie, because they had also spent the war in Kazakhstan. Their mother had also been in a labor camp in Kazakhstan and had ended up in the infirmary and basically never came out again. And I don't know why the children, I can only fathom that they thought it didn't make them seem survivor enough, and they were very concerned that if they revealed that they had actually been in the Soviet Union during the war, that they wouldn't be allowed to come to Canada on the scheme. That's my best guess, because unfortunately both the children are dead, so I was using some existing oral history. But it really struck me that those two children felt compelled to cover up that they had barely survived in Kazakhstan under extreme conditions. And they had to pretend instead that they'd been in, I think, the Lvov ghetto. Like, I mean, it was ludicrous to think that, but they must have feared that if they had told the truth, they wouldn't be admitted on the scheme. Now, I've left my copy of the book sitting over on the bed. I'm going to try to slide across and get it because there's something I want to read to you. If I can find it. So this question of who is a survivor was very important to the book. And either I'm going to find this quickly or I'm just going to skip it. Apologies, but here we go. So I shouldn't have favorites in the book, but I did have a few favorites. They were the stories that were so poignant to me. Sometimes I didn't really know why, but they just deeply spoke to me. And so there are certain voices who are that are repeated through the book. It also helps, I think, there were 100 different stories, but that's quite overwhelming to a reader. So talking with my editor, we decided that there would be some stars, whose voices would be in a lot of different chapters. So one of my stars is this wonderful woman, Felice Zed. I'm going to read to you a little bit about her. So she, in 1983, she was only just beginning to learn who she was. The year before, at the age of 42, she had finally had confirmation that her parents had been murdered in Auschwitz. Now, her story was very interesting. She and her family were deported from Germany to France, and there's a French concentration camp French internment camp in the south of France called Gurs. And her parents and her, along with her older sister, were confined there. And then the two children were smuggled out and survived the war in hiding in Catholic France. So here she was in her early 40s, so more or less the same age as me. And she struck up the courage to attend the first American gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors, which was the largest meeting of Holocaust survivors ever held in April 1983 in Washington, D.C. Hoping to meet others with similar stories, but uncertain where her own story fitted into the broader context of surviving the Holocaust, she braved the criticism of older survivors who told her, "You were a child, so what do you know? You don't remember." Speaking with a volunteer who recorded an interview with her at this event, so this is April 1983, they had some roving interviewers wandering around the halls. There were 30,000 survivors at this incredible event, and they recorded thousands of interviews, some large number with child survivors who happened to be there. And this is what Felice said. "People don't understand, and it's very hard for me to talk about it. I don't belong. I didn't go to a camp. I didn't suffer in that way. There was nothing to show for it. I felt that I'm not a survivor, but then I thought, well, hold on, I am a survivor in my own way. My parents died. My whole family died. And besides my sister and myself, everyone else is gone. So if I'm not a survivor, what am I?" And I was very, very struck by Felice's, this remarkable tone also in this interview from 1983. I thought, of course, if your whole family has been killed and you are the only one left, what are you if you're not a survivor? So my own personal take on who is a survivor is quite broad, but I'm much more interested actually in the historical context, in the way we change our definition of survivor as time goes by. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum takes a very, very broad definition now of who is a Holocaust survivor, but that was not always the case. And I think it continues to change because, of course, most of the people who do the work of being docents at the museum and going around to schools and giving talks and participating in Britain, Holocaust Memorial Day is happening this week. It is a very important event. There will be survivors speaking to many British schools over Zoom, obviously, this year. And who is doing all that work now? Child survivors, because they're the only ones left. I can hear my children. They may come bursting in the door at any minute.
Okay, so quickly, Janice Barling posted in the chat, do you know anything about the Ochberg survivors, child survivors or orphans who were sent to South Africa?
I do not know very much about the South African scheme, I'm afraid, because partly nobody seems to have done any research on it. It would be a really good project to get a PhD student or even a competent master's student doing with connections to South Africa. I don't know how many children were involved in the South African scheme. I know the cutoff age was quite a bit younger for the South African scheme than other schemes. So the Canadian scheme took children under the age of 18. The British scheme took children up to 18. Of course, they actually took children who were like 21 and 22 and lied about their age. But in theory, you had to be around that age. But the South African scheme took children only younger than 12. I imagine that means that they mostly wanted to have those children adopted into families. I would love to know more about the scheme, but as I say, I'm not aware of any historical research on that scheme.
Okay, so Yocheved Katan, I think, do you want to ask a question or make a comment? Okay, so just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have two things, very short. Julia I'm talking to you, Julia Calote. Remember 6 years ago on, on Holocaust remembrance in the shul in Kingston, you and I did an interview to each other. And I remember that Susan Phillips she invited me to talk to Julia, and that we made a presentation to the people who were sitting there. I asked you, Julia, what do you know about your childhood? And she said, I don't know anything. I don't know anything about my family. I cannot do with you a presentation together because I don't know anything. So I asked her 8 questions. I sent them by email, and you called me back and you gave me answers. And that was the base for our presentation. Remember, Julia?
I totally remember, of course.
That went very well. You knew so much. You knew.
Well,
Okay, my other thing is, am I back in the,
Yes.
Susan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Since I live here, and that is now 30 years, I come from Holland, I'm born in Amsterdam. I was born in 1943, so I'm a child Holocaust survivor, as I call it always. And I'm also a school teacher. I have taught my story about 85 times in all the schools in and around Kingston. Suddenly, I hear from my coordinator that the school board is changed, and she gave to the new school board all the information about me because I'm still willing to do it. I can 2 years more do this. I'm 78 now. And I've never heard anything, just nothing about the schools. So it is not my task to say, hey, hello, I can do this. No, this is a lost case because I'm not invited to go to schools. But I'm willing. The other thing is, we have here made trees from survivors when the survivors were still alive. There are 11 trees, and they are all now stored somewhere in Bet Israel on the floor or wherever. I saw them laying on the floor. It broke my heart because that is also material to show children what those survivors who were alive at that time went through. I am still the only Holocaust survivor here in Kingston who can do that because I knew all those people. Why is there not a project for children to visit the trees? They have to be set up in a space. Yes, I know, there's some work, but it is worth it. So I'm just alarming that here in Kingston, all the stories are gone. They are going. Thank you very much. I hope somebody can have a solution for all this.
Okay, so, and maybe I can frame that into a bit of a question as well, that, and Rabbi Tepper raised this in a sense too. I'm curious about the reactions of if you're aware of any reactions of child survivors who've read the book, and whether you've been invited. I know you've been invited to give many scholarly talks or community talks.
Yeah, I wrote my own book.
Yeah, no, I'm talking to Rebecca now.
I have it.
Sorry.
I have your book.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
I'm telling you that I have her book. It's on my shelf. But you're asking if I think, Susan, if I've had a chance to actually go and talk to the child survivors I interviewed and also others. So yes, the answer is it wasn't that long ago, actually, that the Association for Jewish Refugees, which is a big British organization, it's not only child survivors. It's actually mostly those who came on the Kindertransport or those who came as adults on the domestic domestic worker scheme before the war. So in 1938 and 1939, they're quite a sizable group in Britain. And they're a very, very lively group that run a lot of events. And they asked me to give a talk on the 12th of December, I think, so like about a little over a month ago. And I was just thrilled to look out at the sea of faces on Zoom, and there was over 100 people there, and see so many of the child survivors I interviewed. And it was, I was very grateful to have the opportunity to explain some things that have weighed on me. One of the questions I agreed beforehand with the person who was running the talk was that we would talk about the sense of responsibility one has when you do interviews. What do you do about the ones you don't include? Because as I said earlier, I had to let some voices sort of speak more loudly just to keep the book from being like a chaotic jumble. So if you do read the book, you'll notice that certain names come up in a lot of chapters. And others, even though their stories were so moving to me, did not make it in. Sometimes they made it into a part that was cut because in the end there were, we had to trim down some chapters, and or sometimes they didn't make their, I can't tell you why. It's just that for whatever reason, they didn't quite, two people were telling a similar story. One articulated it in a way that just made more sense for the writing of the book, and the other story never made it in. And it weighed on me very heavily, especially for a few of them where I really had felt a kind of deep sense of a bond with the person I was talking to. And it was so lovely to see them in the audience and explain, your story didn't make it into the book, but that doesn't mean it wasn't important to me. Actually, your story changed the way I thought about everything. And there just happened to be this, when I did that event, there was a woman whose story didn't make it into the book, but I've thought about her story so much. It actually was in an earlier version, and then we cut it out. I can't actually remember too much of her childhood story, but what was so memorable about this interview is she said that she had, a bit like what my mom has said, she struggled so hard to get any information out of her survivor mother. And her mother would not talk about the war, and she would not talk about the war, and she didn't want to talk about it. And this went on and on and on. And finally, in the 1990s, there was a Hidden Child conference. I think it was in New York City. And somehow they both ended up going together to this conference. And this woman, Hanneke, she thought, now's the moment. Finally, my mom is going to come with me to this conference. She's finally acknowledging that, I survived as a hidden child. She's ready to talk about it. And they're sitting together at this conference. And she thought, this is it. I'm going to start, I'm going to open up the space for us to start to talk about this. I'm going to hold her hand. And so she went to touch her mother's hand, and she put her hand on her mother's hand, and her mother pulled her hand away. And this was just, this said so much about that relationship to me. It was this rejection that she thought, this is it. Finally, we can talk honestly. But her mother wasn't ready to do that, and she was never ready to do that. And instead, she pulled her hand away. It framed so beautifully so much of the nature of the relationship between child survivors and their surviving parents, or even child survivors and their adopted parents. That could also be a very fraught relationship. And I so loved that, and it didn't end up in the book. And so it was so fabulous to see Hanneke there. And I said, Hanneke, would you tell your story about you when you tried to hold your mom's hand? And she told the story, and she was in tears, and I was in tears. And, talking about not being very scientific and definitely not holding. I mean, I often actually cry because it's emotional and I feel the emotions. And I said, but, Hanneke, it didn't make it in the book, but it changed everything about the way I think. And I'm not even sure I remember how I started telling you this story.
It was really moving, though.
It remains incredibly moving for me because I think about Hanneke's story a lot. Because in a way, you know, my mom could have told that story. It would have been similar. As she has alluded to, my grandmother did not want to talk about this. Towards the very, very end of her 100 years on earth, she did want to tell me. But I think it's only because she recognized, not that I wanted to know as a granddaughter, but as a historian. And so she told me a lot, but it took like 97 years.
So Rebecca, can I just check if you're okay to go till the half hour? It'll be,
Yes.
yeah, okay. And please, people, if you have to sign off, by all means do. But what you were just talking about leads very well into Esther Saxon's question about what are the factors that make children deny being Jewish compared to being proud of their Jewish origins. And I say it leads in well because my recollection, having known Julia for a long time, is I'm not even Jewish, was her sort of approach until you came along and expressed interest in being Jewish. So
Mom has a great story. She probably doesn't. I'm not gonna, I don't want to make you tell your story, Mom. The story I'm thinking of is the story about how you identified yourself. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, no, I'm happy to tell it, just very briefly.
It's one of my favorite stories.
Well, if it's the same story, I hope, but I worked for many years in the psychology department of a psychiatric hospital. And because I got into doing therapy with people who were psychiatric patients, I felt the need to also have some therapy myself. It was called like a training therapy. So I made an appointment with a lovely old gentleman, a doctor who was a psychoanalytically minded therapist. And he sat me down. Well, I don't know how old I was then, 65 or so. Sat me down and said, "So, Julia, tell me about yourself." And with that open question, I looked at him and I said, "Well, I'm a Hungarian Jew." And then I sort of looked at what I had just said. It hung as a balloon kind of in front of me. What an amazing thing to have said, because I didn't say, you know, I work at the hospital and I have 2 kids and all the other stuff that were my basic identity, but it was my core identity. I am a Hungarian Jew. It just bubbled out of me. I'm very surprising. I did a lot of work on it in my therapy.
Thank you.
If I think, so I have thought that's one of my mother's stories that I have thought about a lot. I thought about it a lot in the context of this book because there was no straightforward approach to being Jewish among these 100 children, obviously now in their 70s and 80s. There was every sort of hue and color of that particular story, all the way from intense pride in being Jewish through to a very complex relationship, through to a total rejection of Judaism. And some small child is knocking on the door. Yes? Yes? Are you coming in? Hi, I'm giving a talk. Are you coming to say hello? Go on then. Nana is in the talk too. I knew this would happen eventually. I think it depended very much on the post-war. Addie, no, you gotta be quiet if you're gonna stay in the room. It depended on the post-war conditions of that child. Especially something actually we were going to talk about today, we haven't talked about yet, is whether or not that child was returned to their family of origins or went into a care home. Because of the nature of this amazing network of care homes that existed for child survivors after the war, they were mostly funded by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee or by parallel organizations. And so all those homes were run as Jewish homes. Now that in and of itself meant a lot of different things. Sometimes they were Jewish communist homes. Sometimes they were really Orthodox. There was sort of every different approach to being Jewish, straight through from the purely cultural and not at all religious, through to the very, very religious. Children who lived in those homes tended to imbibe the atmosphere of those homes and go on to live it. So those in the Orthodox homes tended to stay Orthodox. Those who were in the, for example, the Jewish communist homes tended to be secular humanists, but feel themselves very deeply to be Jewish. But those who were returned to live with a surviving parent, or maybe a surviving grandmother or aunt or uncle or family member, they had more complicated relationships with Judaism. And that was because their parents did too. Many of them deeply rejected Judaism. Others were, I mean, there was no pattern to it. It was every type of lived experience, I suppose, which maybe isn't really a surprise. I'm just trying to think if I can come up with a really compelling example. Well, it's funny, actually, what I think of when I'm trying to think of an example is that I've just said that those who grew up in care homes often had a maybe a more natural relationship to religious Judaism than others. But that even in and of itself could be quite complicated, especially when they aged out of those care homes. I'm thinking, for example, of several women who told me how embarrassed they were when they got married, that even though they had grown up in an Orthodox care home, they had no idea how to keep a kosher kitchen. How would they? They hadn't ever been allowed in the kitchen. So they didn't know these sort of things you would know if you were in a family home, and they were embarrassed about that in front of their husbands' families. Then there were those who had to prove that they were Jewish, had to prove that they were Jewish to get married in the shul. And that was a problem for a lot of them, because they had no proof. Even if they had survived concentration camps, they had no proof that they were Jewish. I tell the story in the book of one of the survivors I talk about a lot in the book, Jackie Y. Partly just because I love his story so much, partly because he's actually ended up becoming a really good friend. He lives in London. Jackie, he did not know that he was adopted until he was about 10 years old. And then a kid at school just told him one day, "Oh, you're adopted." And he went home and he said to his parents, "Am I adopted?" And his parents confessed, "Yes, you are." And they all cried. And Jackie said, "It's okay. I love you anyway. You're my parents as far as I'm concerned." Okay. Then when he was about 15 years old, his grandmother, I think his mother's mother, of course, knowing now his parents were adoptive parents, confessed that he hadn't been born in Britain. That one was harder, because he'd always thought he was just a regular East London Jewish kid. So he went home again, he tried to say to his parents, "Was I born abroad?" And this time they were not willing to, they didn't really want to talk about it. And his mother started to say things like, "Don't ask your father, it hurts him so much. Please just don't talk about it." So then, and this was actually quite common experience of child survivors as they became teenagers, that they started to sort of push against parents who weren't very forthcoming with information. So Jackie started to try to push to learn more, because this was really curious, and his parents really didn't want to tell him. But it only really exploded when he wanted to get married in the shul, because he had to prove that he was Jewish. So they went, he and his mother and his fiance and his fiance's mother went to the shul. And the secretary asked them for proof that both he and his wife-to-be were Jewish. And his adoptive mother said, "We're just going to have to take my word for it." And the secretary said, "No, that's not good enough. You're going to have to get some proof." And so his adoptive mother said, "Okay, I have something in the safe deposit box. You wait and I'll go get it." So they all trooped off to the bank, got this piece of paper out of the safe deposit box. Meanwhile, his mother, Jackie's mother, wouldn't let him see what the paper was. And he's thinking, what is going on? And all this, years of actually sort of concealment and the lies and everything's kind of become fraught by this point. And they go back to the shul. His mother hands over to the secretary this piece of paper. And when the secretary hands it back, Jackie grabs it. And he's totally devastated to see that he was in a concentration camp. He had no idea. He was 20 years old at that point. And they're standing in the shul screaming at each other. And it's a very pivotal moment in his life, where he both felt from that moment on a burning desire to know who he was and where he came from. and also really kind of clinched things with his parents, who just did not want to give any of the information. So all that to say that it could be a great challenge to be Jewish in many ways. And there were these kind of big life moments that made child survivors embarrassed in some cases, that they didn't know more about themselves. Many did tell me, you know, I don't know how to do this or that properly. I don't quite feel that I'm really Jewish, and especially if they grew up in adoptive homes or even in a home like the one my mother grew up in. It could be a very challenging identity. Of course, then there's also the issue of children who were in hiding with Christian families, who often really loved their Christian families and were in areas where there was deep anti-Semitism in the Christian culture, and they imbibed that from their Christian families and felt worried to return to Jewish communities and maybe never really let go of that. But I think there's probably every range of possible relationship with Judaism. It actually isn't something I go into deeply in the book, partly just because there was so many different experiences. But I love that story of Jackie's, because it was just there at that moment of trying to belong, of trying to show, yes, I am actually Jewish, that he really learned who he was. And actually, when I did that event, you asked me before about doing that event for the Association of Jewish Refugees, he did it together with me. And it was wonderful to speak. And he told his story a little bit like my mom has told her story today.
So I feel like we need to let you get back to those kids.
They're okay. They're getting a bedtime story.
Okay. I feel we've kept you longer than I expected, but only because it was so interesting and moving. While I ramble on thanking you, if you could put in the chat, if there are one or two links to other talks that you've given that people might want to listen to. And I feel like a bit of a shill for the book, but please, I think the best way to know more about what Rebecca's work is about is to read the book. And I don't easily read nonfiction. I feel like my whole life is nonfiction and I like to read. And this book, as I said at the beginning, was one that I just sunk into and thoroughly enjoyed isn't quite the right word, but that I found incredibly meaningful and worth reading. So I thank you so much, Rebecca. And every now and then somebody's been texting me on the side saying, that made me cry. It was so moving. That was so interesting. It's such an interesting combination of the personal and the historical. And I say this to Julia too, because I think it is not easy to tell one story, and you tell it in a way that is both interesting and moving, and that fits so well with the historiography of what Rebecca has worked on. No surprise, I guess, mother and daughter.
Listen, when I started my PhD, I was at Oxford, and I remember going to a seminar like really early on, maybe in my first year, and sitting down, and just before the seminar started, having a very informal chat with some of the really famous historians there. And one of them was Jane Kaplan. She's retired now, incredible historian of modern and contemporary Germany. And I remember her saying, I don't know why historians are so dishonest. We always pretend to be objective, and we're not supposed to work on topics that have to do with our own lives. What a load of crap. We work on things that have to do with our own lives. Why would we not? You should feel that it to you, that you're passionate about it, and then work on our over that. And I think more or less ever since then, I've been slowly kind of walking towards my own family's history. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. This book isn't about my family, but that's partly because one day I am going to write one that is. So I have held off a lot, and it's, it's coming. I realized working on this book, I was talking, I had a lovely, fabulous editor for this book. And we were talking about future book projects, and he laughed and he said, "Oh, Rebecca, you're writing a trilogy." And I realize now it's actually 4 books and they're coming, but it isn't a topic I feel done with. Maybe I'll never be done with it. That's so exciting to know, to find something you want to keep working on.
Well, and I understand your mother has a whole load of documents.
Oh, yes, she does. I have made her save those
Yeah.
because that book needs to be written, and it's always kind of writing itself in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
And I've just put up in the chat, there's a if you search on the Wiener Library YouTube page, you'll find a talk I gave. It was the launch for the book, actually. On the YouTube page for the Association of Jewish Refugees, you will find that talk I gave with Jackie Y, which was also really an absolute pleasure. And my email address is there. Please, if you want to get in touch, don't hesitate to drop me a line. It's a little chaotic at the minute in the sense that we are working at the university while also homeschooling our children, and Britain is in utter chaos, but I will eventually get around to answering your email, I promise.
Okay, we have recorded this, but I will make that available to you, Rebecca, but not to anybody else unless you okay.
It's
that.
okay with me. I can okay it right now. It's not
okay. And it's also been transcribed, or it will be transcribed.
Fabulous on Otter.
Yes, on Otter, exactly. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you. I'm astounded at the number of people who showed up, and it's very moving to see people, members of Julia and Rebecca's family, and the breadth of people who've come to this, and from across the Kingston community and across the world. So thanks to everyone as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susan, for hosting this and doing so much to organize it.
Fun.